David Williams looked at his watch as he stepped out of the black sedan at the airport. 6:30 in the morning, and the terminal was already buzzing with travelers rushing to catch their flights. He grabbed his leather briefcase from the back seat and thanked his driver, a routine they had followed hundreds of times before. At 45 years old, David had learned that success often came dressed in simple clothes. While other wealthy businessmen wore expensive suits and flashy watches, he preferred his comfortable jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and worn leather shoes that had walked him through countless deals. His briefcase, though expensive, looked ordinary enough that no one would guess it contained contracts worth millions of dollars. David had built his empire the hard way. 25 years ago, he was a college dropout working construction jobs to pay rent on a tiny apartment. His mother had cleaned offices at night to help him buy his first piece of land, a rundown lot in what everyone called the worst part of town. People laughed when he said he would turn it into something special. They stopped laughing when that lot became a successful shopping center. From that first property, David kept buying and building. He had a gift for seeing potential where others saw problems. An abandoned warehouse became luxury apartments. A forgotten strip mall turned into a thriving business complex. Empty lots transformed into profitable parking facilities. Each success gave him the money to buy more land and take bigger risks. Now David owned over 2,000 acres across 3 states. His properties included shopping centers where families bought groceries, office buildings where thousands of people worked every day, and transportation hubs that kept cities moving. The airport he was walking through sat on land his company leased to the city. The parking garages, the rental car lots, even the ground beneath the main terminal. David's signature was on the contracts that made it all possible. But success had not changed who David was at heart. He still remembered what it felt like to count every dollar, to worry about making rent, to have people judge him based on how he looked rather than what he could do. That was why he chose to fly commercial instead of owning a private jet. He wanted to stay connected to regular people and their experiences. This morning's flight was especially important. David was heading to a board meeting that could change everything for his company. A group of international investors wanted to partner with him to expand his business overseas. The meeting had been months in the planning, and David had prepared for every possible question they might ask. He checked in at the counter, showing his identification to the airline clerk. She smiled professionally as she handed him his boarding pass. First class, seat 2A. David had specifically chosen that seat because it was quiet and had a good view. Perfect for reviewing contracts during the 6-hour flight to his destination. Walking through security, David noticed how people looked at him. Some saw a middle-aged black man in casual clothes and made assumptions about where he was going, or what he could afford. Others recognized the confident way he carried himself and the quality of his briefcase, understanding that appearances could be deceiving. David had learned long ago that both reactions said more about other people than they said about him. In the departure lounge, David found a quiet corner and opened his briefcase. Inside were the documents that represented years of work: property deeds, financial statements, architectural plans, and legal contracts. The international deal would allow him to buy land in 3 different countries and build the same kind of successful developments that had made him wealthy in America. As he reviewed the numbers, David thought about how far he had come. The boy who had worked construction to afford community college was now sitting in an airport, preparing for a meeting that could make his company truly global. His mother, who had passed away 5 years ago, would have been proud to see what her encouragement and sacrifice had helped create. David's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. The investors were excited about the meeting and had already prepared preliminary contracts based on his proposals. Everything was falling into place exactly as he had hoped. Boarding began 30 minutes before departure. David waited until they called first-class passengers, then walked to the gate. The flight attendant scanned his boarding pass and welcomed him aboard with a professional smile. He made his way down the narrow aisle toward his seat, briefcase in hand and contracts organized for easy access during the flight. Seat 2A was everything David had hoped for. Window seat with plenty of legroom and a small table perfect for spreading out documents. He placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, keeping only the most important papers in a folder beside him. The plane was filling up quickly, and David watched other passengers find their seats while he organized his materials. This was going to be a productive flight. David had 6 hours to review every detail of the proposed international expansion, make final notes on his presentation, and prepare for questions the investors might ask. By the time the plane landed, he would be ready for the most important business meeting of his career. As more passengers boarded, David settled into his seat and opened the first contract. The legal language was complex, but David had learned to read these documents carefully over the years. Every clause mattered when millions of dollars were involved. He made notes in the margins and highlighted important sections, completely focused on the work ahead. The flight attendants were going through their safety demonstrations, but David had heard it all before. He kept reading, reviewing financial projections and studying architectural plans for the proposed developments. The international investors wanted to build shopping centers and office complexes, just like the ones that had made David successful in America. If everything went according to plan, this meeting would mark the beginning of a truly global business empire. David looked out the window at the ground crew preparing the plane for departure. In a few hours, he would be sitting across from some of the most powerful business people in the world, discussing deals that would change his life forever. He had worked too hard and come too far to let anything go wrong now. The plane had been in the air for about 20 minutes when David first noticed the woman staring at him. She was sitting 2 rows behind him in first class, a well-dressed lady who looked to be in her 50s. Every time David glanced back, she was looking in his direction with an expression he couldn't quite read. David tried to focus on his contracts, but something about her stare made him uncomfortable. He had experienced this kind of attention before, people who seemed surprised to see a black man in first class, as if his presence there was somehow wrong or unexpected. Usually he ignored these looks and continued with his business. Today felt different somehow. The woman got up from her seat and walked toward the front of the plane. David assumed she was going to the bathroom, but instead, she stopped right next to his row. She stood there for a moment, looking down at him with her arms crossed. "Excuse me," she said in a voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I think you're in my seat." David looked up from his papers, genuinely confused. He double-checked his boarding pass, which clearly showed seat 2A. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat," he said politely, showing her the boarding pass. "C2A." The woman barely glanced at the boarding pass. "That can't be right," she said, her voice getting louder. "I always sit in 2A when I fly this route. There must be some kind of mistake." Other passengers were starting to turn around and watch the interaction. David felt the familiar weight of being the center of unwanted attention. He had learned over the years that these situations required careful handling. Too aggressive and people would call him angry. Too passive and people would walk all over him. "Ma'am, I purchased this seat specifically," David explained calmly. "If there's been some kind of double booking, I'm sure the flight attendants can help sort it out." Instead of calling for help, the woman shook her head firmly. "You don't understand," she said. "I'm a platinum member of this airline. I have status. I fly this exact route twice a month for business, and I always sit in this seat. You probably belong back in coach anyway." The last comment hit David like a slap. He felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "I paid for this seat just like you paid for yours. If you check your boarding pass, I'm sure you'll find your actual seat number." The woman's face was getting red now. "Don't tell me what to check," she snapped. "I know what I paid for, and I know where I'm supposed to sit." "This is ridiculous." A flight attendant finally noticed the commotion and hurried over. She was a young woman who looked nervous about getting involved in what was clearly becoming a heated situation. "Is everything okay here?" the flight attendant asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. The woman immediately turned to the flight attendant with a completely different voice, sweet and reasonable. Like butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. "Yes, there seems to be a seating mix-up. This gentleman is in my seat, and I was hoping you could help resolve it." David held up his boarding pass again. "This is my assigned seat," he said to the flight attendant. "I have my confirmation number and receipt if you need to verify the purchase." The flight attendant looked at both boarding passes, and David could see the confusion on her face. The woman's pass clearly showed a different seat number, 4C, not 2A. But instead of simply pointing this out, the flight attendant seemed to hesitate. "Sir," the flight attendant said to David, "would you mind terribly if we found you another seat?" just to avoid any further unpleasantness? David felt his heart sink. Even with clear proof that he was in the right seat, even with his boarding pass showing 2A, the flight attendant was asking him to move. Not the woman who was obviously wrong, but him. "Why should I move?" David asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm in my assigned seat. I have important work to do during this flight, which is why I specifically chose this seat and paid extra for it." The woman jumped back into the conversation. "Work?" she said with a laugh that didn't sound friendly. "What kind of work could you possibly have that's more important than mine? I'm flying to close $1 million deal." David looked at the woman carefully. Her expensive clothes, her confident attitude, her assumption that her work was more important than his, it all painted a picture he had seen many times before. Someone who believed that success and importance were written on the outside, that you could judge a person's worth by how they looked or what they wore. "Ma'am," David said quietly, "you have no idea what kind of work I do or where I'm going, just like I don't know about your business. The difference is I'm not making assumptions about what you deserve based on how you look." The comment seemed to make the woman even angrier. "How I look," she repeated. "This has nothing to do with how anyone looks. This is about airline policies and seating assignments and customer service. I'm a loyal customer of this airline, and I expect to be treated with respect." "So do I," David replied, "which is why I'd like to sit in the seat I paid for." More passengers were watching now, and David could hear whispered conversations behind him. Some people seemed to be on his side, shaking their heads at the woman's behavior. Others looked uncomfortable, like they wished the whole situation would just go away. The flight attendant was clearly in over her head. "Let me get the head flight attendant," she said, and hurried toward the front of the plane. While they waited, the woman continued to stand next to David's seat, as if her presence there would somehow make him disappear. She kept muttering under her breath about customer service and airline policies and how things used to be different. David tried to return to his contracts, but it was impossible to concentrate with the woman hovering over him. He thought about his mother, who had taught him to pick his battles carefully. She had always said that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, because if you don't stand up for yourself, no one else will. The head flight attendant arrived, an older man who looked like he had dealt with difficult passengers before. He listened to both sides of the story, checked both boarding passes, and confirmed what everyone already knew. David was in the correct seat, and the woman belonged in 4C. But instead of ending the matter there, he also asked David if he would consider moving to keep the peace. When David politely but firmly declined, the head flight attendant sighed like David was being unreasonable. That was when David realized this situation was about much more than a seat on an airplane. It was about respect, assumptions, and the way some people believed the world should work. It was about whether a successful black businessman had the same right to keep his paid seat as anyone else on that plane. David pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. It was time to make a call. David scrolled through his phone contacts while the woman continued to stand beside his seat, arms crossed and foot tapping impatiently. The head flight attendant had walked away after David refused to move, probably hoping the situation would resolve itself. Other passengers were pretending to read magazines or look out windows, but David could feel their eyes on him. He found the number he was looking for and pressed call. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Williams Holdings, this is Patricia." "Patricia, it's David. I need you to connect me with Tom Rodriguez at the airport immediately." Patricia had been David's assistant for 8 years. She knew that tone in his voice. Calm but serious, the way he sounded when something needed to be handled quickly and efficiently. "Of course, Mr. Williams. Is everything all right?" "I'll explain later. Just get Tom on the line, please." While Patricia worked on connecting the call, David looked around the first-class cabin. The woman was still standing there, now checking her watch and sighing loudly every few seconds. The flight attendants were busy with other passengers, probably hoping the problem would solve itself. A businessman across the aisle was watching the whole thing with obvious interest. David's phone buzzed. "Mr. Williams? I have Tom Rodriguez on the line." "Put him through." Tom Rodriguez was the airport's director of ground operations, a position that required him to coordinate with dozens of companies and contractors every day. What Tom didn't know, and what very few people at the airport knew, was exactly how much of the airport property was owned or controlled by David's company. David, good to hear from you. How's the flight? Well, Tom, that's actually why I'm calling. I'm on Flight 447 and we need to have a conversation about passenger treatment policies. Tom's voice immediately became more serious. What's happening? David explained the situation calmly and clearly. He described the woman's demands that he give up his paid seat, the flight attendant's suggestion that he move to keep the peace, and the general assumption that he was somehow the problem that needed to be solved. Let me get this straight, Tom said after David finished. You're in your assigned seat, you have your boarding pass, and they're asking you to move because this other passenger is making a scene? That's exactly what's happening. Tom was quiet for a moment. David could hear papers shuffling in the background. Tom was probably pulling up information about the flight, the passenger manifest, maybe even checking on any previous complaints involving this particular woman. David, Tom said finally, you know that Williams Holdings has contracts with this airline for ground services, terminal space, and parking facilities, right? I'm aware of our business relationships, yes. And you know that your company invested $52 million in airport infrastructure improvements over the past 3 years? Tom, I don't need a reminder of my own investments. No, but I think this airline needs a reminder of who makes their operations possible at this airport. David could hear Tom typing on his computer. I'm looking at the contracts now. Williams Holdings provides ground handling services, owns the leases on 2 cargo facilities, and holds the master agreement on terminal parking. Without your company's cooperation, this airline couldn't operate their hub here. The woman next to David was getting more agitated. She had started talking to other passengers, trying to get them to support her position. This is ridiculous, she was saying loudly. I've been flying with this airline for 15 years. I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of treatment. Tom, David said into the phone, I want this plane turned around. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You want me to have them return to the gate? That's exactly what I want. This airline needs to understand that discrimination against passengers is not acceptable on any flight, but especially not on flights operating out of facilities that my company makes possible. David, are you sure about this? Turning around a commercial flight is going to create a lot of attention. David thought about his mother, who had cleaned office buildings for years while dreaming of a better future for her son. He thought about all the times he had been judged by his appearance, all the assumptions people had made about what he could or couldn't afford, what he did or didn't deserve. I'm absolutely sure, David said. And Tom, make sure they understand this isn't just about one passenger complaint. This is about Williams Holdings' expectations for how all passengers are treated on flights using our facilities. I'll make the call right now. David hung up and put his phone back in his pocket. The woman was still standing beside his seat, but now she was talking to the head flight attendant again, gesturing dramatically and speaking in an urgent whisper. Within minutes, David felt the plane beginning to change direction. The subtle shift in engine sound and the slight, banking motion told him that the pilot was already responding to Tom's call to ground operations. The head flight attendant walked quickly toward the front of the cabin and picked up the intercom handset. His voice came over the speakers with the kind of forced calm that airline employees used when delivering bad news. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your head flight attendant speaking. We've received word from ground operations that we need to return to the gate to resolve a passenger service issue. We should be back at the terminal in approximately 15 minutes. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. The reaction in the cabin was immediate. Passengers started checking their phones, calling people to report delays and asking flight attendants what was happening. The woman next to David looked confused and angry. What passenger service issue? She demanded of anyone who would listen. The only issue here is that this man won't move to his proper seat. A businessman across the aisle who had been watching the entire confrontation spoke up for the first time. Ma'am, I saw both boarding passes. He's in the right seat. You're the one causing the problem. Other passengers began to murmur agreement. Someone behind David said, She's been making a scene this whole time. Another voice added, He showed his boarding pass like 5 times. The woman's face turned red as she realized that the other passengers were not supporting her position. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to understand that maybe, just maybe, she was not the victim in this situation. David opened his contract folder and tried to return to his work. but concentration was impossible. He could feel the eyes of every passenger in first class on him, could hear whispered conversations about what might happen when they reached the gate. The pilot's voice came over the intercom next. "Folks, we're beginning our descent back to the airport. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." As the plane descended, David thought about what would happen next. Tom Rodriguez would be waiting at the gate, probably with airport security and maybe some airline executives. The woman who had started this whole mess was about to learn something about making assumptions based on appearances. David had built his business empire by staying calm under pressure, by thinking several steps ahead of his opponents, and by understanding that real power was often invisible until the moment it needed to be used. Today, all of those lessons were about to pay off in a way that none of his fellow passengers could possibly imagine. The plane touched down and began taxiing toward the gate. Through his window, David could see vehicles with flashing lights waiting on the tarmac. The woman was still standing in the aisle, but now she looked nervous rather than angry. In a few minutes, everyone on Flight 447 was going to understand exactly who David Williams was, and why no one should ever judge a person by how they look. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, and David could see through his window that this was not a normal arrival. 3 airport security vehicles were parked nearby, along with what looked like a black SUV with official plates. Several people in business suits stood waiting on the jetway, and David recognized Tom Rodriguez among them. The pilot's voice came over the intercom one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we address a passenger service matter. This should only take a few minutes." The woman who had been standing by David's seat for the past 20 minutes finally sat down in an empty seat across the aisle. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked uncertain. Her confident demands had been replaced by nervous glances toward the front of the plane. The main cabin door opened, and David watched as several people in suits boarded the aircraft. Tom Rodriguez led the group, followed by a woman David didn't recognize who wore an airline uniform with manager's stripes, an airport security chief, and 2 other men in expensive suits who looked like they might be lawyers or executives. Tom walked directly to David's seat, and every passenger in first class watched the interaction with intense curiosity. What they saw surprised them. Tom's face broke into a genuine smile as he approached David, and he extended his hand in greeting. "Mr. Williams," Tom said in a voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I sincerely apologize that you had to experience this situation. This is absolutely not the level of service that Williams Holdings expects from our airline partners." The effect of Tom's words on the cabin was immediate and dramatic. Passengers who had been watching the drama unfold suddenly straightened in their seats. The businessman across the aisle raised his eyebrows in obvious surprise. The woman who had started the whole confrontation went completely pale. David stood up and shook Tom's hand. "Thank you for responding so quickly, Tom. I think we need to have a serious conversation about passenger treatment policies." The airline manager stepped forward, and David could see that she was sweating despite the air conditioning. "Mr. Williams, I'm Janet Palmer, Regional Operations Manager for the airline. I want to personally apologize for this incident and assure you that we take these matters very seriously." David noticed that Janet's voice carried clearly through the cabin, and he realized that Tom had probably instructed her to speak loudly enough for other passengers to hear. This wasn't just about resolving the immediate situation. This was about making sure everyone on the plane understood what had really happened. "Ms. Palmer," David said calmly, "I'd like to understand how your staff was trained to handle this situation. When a passenger shows a valid boarding pass for their assigned seat, what is your policy?" Janet glanced nervously at the woman who had demanded David's seat. "Our policy is to honor seat assignments as shown on boarding passes, unless there's a legitimate safety or operational concern." "And was there a safety or operational concern with me sitting in my assigned seat?" "No, sir, there was not." David nodded thoughtfully. "Then I'm curious why your flight attendant suggested that I should move to accommodate another passenger's demands, especially when that passenger was clearly in the wrong seat according to her own boarding pass." The head flight attendant who had been involved in the earlier conversation was standing near the front of the cabin, and David could see him shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. Janet looked in his direction, then back at David. "Mr. Williams, that was poor judgment on our staff's part. and it does not reflect our company's values or policies. Tom Rodriguez spoke up next. Mr. Williams, I think it's important for everyone to understand the business relationship here. Williams Holdings owns or controls approximately 60% of the commercial land around this airport, including the ground lease for this terminal, the parking facilities, and the cargo handling areas. The airline industry in this city depends on the infrastructure that your company has built and maintains. A murmur went through the cabin as passengers began to understand the significance of what they were witnessing. The woman who had demanded David's seat looked like she wanted to disappear into the airplane floor. One of the men in expensive suits stepped forward and introduced himself as the airline's regional legal counsel. Mr. Williams, we want to make this right immediately. What can we do to address your concerns? David looked around the cabin at all the faces watching him. Some passengers were recording the interaction with their phones, probably planning to post the story on social media. Others were just staring in amazement at the dramatic reversal they were witnessing. First, David said, I want to understand how this passenger was able to demand my seat, despite having a boarding pass for a completely different seat. Second, I want to know why your staff's initial response was to ask me to move rather than to politely redirect her to her correct seat. And third, I want to know what you're going to do to ensure this doesn't happen to other passengers in the future. Janet Palmer was taking notes on everything David said. We will conduct a full investigation into this incident and provide you with a detailed report within 48 hours. The woman who had started the confrontation finally found her voice. I didn't know, she stammered. I had no idea who you were, I just thought. David turned to look at her directly for the first time since the officials had boarded the plane. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. Ma'am, that's exactly the problem. You thought you knew who I was and what I deserved based on how I look. You assumed that your business was more important than mine, that your needs mattered more than mine, and that I should give up what I had paid for to make you comfortable. The woman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. David continued speaking, and his voice carried to every corner of the cabin. The truth is, you don't know anything about me or any other passenger on this plane. You don't know what people do for work, how much money they have, what challenges they've overcome, or what they've achieved in their lives. When you judge people by their appearance and treat them badly because of those judgments, you're not just hurting them. You're showing everyone who you really are. Tom Rodriguez cleared his throat. Mr. Williams, how would you like us to proceed? David thought for a moment. He could have the woman removed from the flight, which would probably result in her missing whatever business meeting she was traveling to attend. He could demand financial compensation from the airline, which they would certainly provide given his business relationship with the airport. He could make this into a public relations nightmare for everyone involved. Instead, David chose a different path. Tom, I want this to be a learning experience for everyone involved. The airline needs to retrain their staff on how to handle these situations properly. This passenger needs to understand how her assumptions and demands affected other people. And everyone on this plane just witnessed what happens when people make judgments based on appearances rather than facts. David sat back down in seat 2A and picked up his contract folder. Now, if we could continue to our original destination, I have some very important business to attend to. The airline manager, the airport officials, and the security team all nodded and began moving toward the exit. The woman who had caused the entire incident was escorted off the plane by security, her face red with embarrassment as every passenger watched her leave. As the officials departed and the plane prepared for takeoff, David could hear whispered conversations throughout the cabin. Passengers were already calling friends and family to tell them about the incredible scene they had just witnessed. The head flight attendant approached David's seat one more time. Mr. Williams, is there anything at all we can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable? David looked up from his contracts and smiled. Just let me work in peace, he said. I have a very important meeting to prepare for. The rest of the flight passed in complete silence around David's seat. Word had spread throughout the entire aircraft about what had happened in first class, and passengers kept walking by to get glimpses of the man who had stopped a commercial airplane with a single phone call. David tried to focus on his contracts, but he could feel the weight of dozens of curious stares. By the time they landed at their destination, several passengers had already posted videos and photos of the incident on social media. David's phone started buzzing with calls and messages before they even reached the gate. His assistant, Patricia, was fielding interview requests from news outlets, and his company's communications director was asking for guidance on how to handle the sudden media attention. The story spread faster than David had expected. Within 6 hours of landing, videos of the airport officials boarding the plane were viral on multiple platforms. The hashtag Seatgate was trending, and news outlets across the country were covering the story of the businessman who owned the airport ground. David's international business meeting went better than he had ever imagined. The investors had seen the news coverage and were impressed not just by David's wealth and property holdings, but by how he had handled the difficult situation. "A man who can command that kind of respect and influence," one investor said, "is exactly the kind of partner we want for our global expansion." The contracts were signed that afternoon, launching David's company into international markets and adding hundreds of millions of dollars to his business empire. But David knew that the real impact of Flight 447 was just beginning. The airline faced immediate backlash from the incident. Social media users shared their own stories of discrimination and poor treatment by airline staff, using David's experience as an example of what passengers should not have to endure. The company's stock price dropped 3% in the first week after the story broke. Janet Palmer, the regional operations manager, called David personally to inform him that the flight attendants involved in the incident had been suspended pending additional training. The airline implemented new policies requiring staff to follow seating assignments strictly and to escalate discrimination complaints to management immediately, rather than asking victims to accommodate prejudiced passengers. The woman who had demanded David's seat faced consequences of her own. Within days, social media users had identified her as Catherine Montgomery, a senior marketing executive at a major consulting firm. Video of her being escorted off the plane had been viewed millions of times, along with her demanding that David give up his paid seat because she always sat in 2A. Catherine's employer initially tried to distance themselves from the incident, saying it was a personal matter that didn't reflect company values. But as the story continued to spread, and customers began questioning whether they wanted to work with a firm that employed someone who treated people so badly, the company was forced to take action. Catherine was placed on administrative leave while they conducted an internal investigation. 3 days later, Catherine released a public apology through her lawyer. "I deeply regret my behavior on Flight 447, the statement read. "My actions were wrong, and I take full responsibility for the hurt and embarrassment I caused. I am committed to learning from this experience and working to become a better person." But the apology felt too little, too late. Catherine's consulting firm announced that she would not be returning to her position. Other companies in the industry quietly made it known that she was not welcome to apply for similar roles elsewhere. Her assumption that she could judge David by his appearance and demand his seat had cost her the career she had spent 15 years building. David used the media attention as an opportunity to talk about issues that were important to him. In interviews with major news outlets, he discussed the everyday discrimination that successful Black Americans still faced, regardless of their achievements or wealth. People see a Black man in casual clothes and make assumptions about what he can afford, where he belongs, what he deserves, David explained to a national television audience. They don't see the years of hard work, the risks taken, the barriers overcome. They just see someone they think they can push around. David also talked about the importance of judging people by their character and actions rather than their appearance. "Success doesn't always wear expensive clothes," he said. "Respect shouldn't depend on whether someone looks like what you expect. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what assumptions you might make about them." The story inspired changes beyond just the airline industry. Several major corporations reviewed their customer service training programs to address unconscious bias. Business schools began using David's experience as a case study in their courses about leadership and crisis management. David established the Williams Foundation for Equal Treatment, funded with $10 million from his international business deal. The foundation provided scholarships for young people from underrepresented communities who wanted to pursue careers in business, real estate, and aviation. The scholarship recipients learned not just about building wealth and success, but about using their achievements to create positive change for others. 6 months after the incident, David received a handwritten letter from Catherine Montgomery. In it, she apologized again for her behavior and explained how the experience had forced her to confront her own prejudices and assumptions. She had entered therapy to work on understanding why she had acted the way she did, and she was volunteering with organizations that fought discrimination. "I realize now that I was exactly the kind of person I always claimed I wasn't," Catherine wrote. "Seeing the video of myself demanding your seat, hearing my own voice making those assumptions about you, was like looking in a mirror and not recognizing the person staring back at me. I'm working every day to become someone better," David wrote back, thanking her for the apology and encouraging her continued growth. He believed that people could change when they were willing to do the hard work of examining their own behavior and attitudes. The incident also led to lasting changes in how David approached his own business. He began requiring unconscious bias training for all employees in his company and made diversity and inclusion a key part of his corporate mission. He started mentoring young entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities, sharing not just business advice but lessons about perseverance in the face of discrimination. A year later, David was invited to speak at a major airline industry conference about customer service and equal treatment. In his speech, he returned to the lesson that had started it all. Never judge a passenger by their appearance, he told the audience of airline executives and employees. The person in the economy seat might be a CEO taking a short flight. The person in casual clothes might own the ground your airport sits on. The person you think doesn't belong in first class might be exactly the person your company needs to treat with the utmost respect. David's story became a powerful reminder that assumptions based on appearance are not just wrong, they can be costly in ways that people never expect. The woman who thought she could judge a man by his clothes and demand his seat had learned that lesson the hard way, losing her career and reputation in the process. But David's story was also about the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult. By refusing to give up his seat and making that phone call, David had created a moment that changed policies, started conversations, and reminded people that respect and dignity should never depend on how someone looks or what assumptions others might make about them. The boy who had worked construction to afford college, whose mother cleaned offices to help him buy his first piece of land, had built more than a business empire. He had created a legacy of standing up for equal treatment and proving that success comes in many different forms, most of which can't be judged by appearances alone.